The stagecoach rumbled to a halt in a cloud of dust as the August sun beat down mercilessly on Petaluma, California, in 1875. Julia Lawson clutched her 6-month-old daughter Emma tighter against her chest, the baby's soft whimpers barely audible over the commotion of the busy station. 23 years old with nowhere to go, Julia stepped down from the coach with trembling legs, her gaze sweeping over the unfamiliar town that would either be her salvation or her final disappointment. "Last stop, madam," the driver called as he tossed down her single weathered trunk. "Welcome to Petaluma." Julia adjusted the thin shawl around her shoulders and squared them despite her exhaustion. The journey from Philadelphia had taken every last penny she possessed, but staying there after William's death and her family's rejection had been impossible. The advertisement she'd seen in the paper had promised work for a housekeeper at a cattle ranch outside of town. It was her only hope now. "Excuse me," she asked a weathered old man sitting on a bench outside the station, "could you direct me to the Silver Creek Ranch?" "I'm told it's owned by a Mr. Sebastian Ryder." The man squinted up at her, his gaze lingering on the baby. "Ryder's place, that's a good 5 miles west of town, madam, not the sort of walk you'd want to make with a little one." He glanced around. "Might be Charlie Wilson's still got his wagon in town. He sometimes does errands for Ryder." "Thank you," Julia replied, her heart sinking at the prospect of finding yet another ride when she had no money to pay for it. She wandered toward the main street with Emma growing fussier by the minute. The baby needed to be fed and changed, but Julia had nowhere private to tend to her. Her letter of application had been vague about her circumstances. She'd simply presented herself as a widow seeking respectable work. She hadn't mentioned Emma at all, fearing that no one would hire a woman with an infant. After an hour of wandering and inquiring, Julia found herself at the general store where the proprietor's wife took pity on her, allowing her to use a back room to care for Emma. "You're heading out to Ryder's place?" the woman asked, watching as Julia gently rocked Emma after feeding her. "Are you kin to him?" "No, madam," Julia admitted. "I've come about the housekeeper position." The woman's expression changed subtly. "Did he know you'd be bringing a child?" Julia's silence was answer enough. "Sebastian Ryder's not known for his patience, dear," the woman said kindly. "He's fair but particular about his arrangements. Been running that ranch alone since his brother died 2 years back." Before Julia could respond, the door opened, and a tall man with broad shoulders entered, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "Mrs. Foster," he nodded at the shopkeeper's wife, then his gaze fell on Julia and Emma. He paused, studying them with piercing blue eyes that made Julia's heart skip nervously. "Mr. Ryder," Mrs. Foster exclaimed. "What good timing. This young lady says she's come about your advertisement for a housekeeper." Sebastian Ryder removed his hat, revealing dark hair with touches of silver at the temples, despite appearing to be in his early 30s. His face, tanned from years under the California sun, remained unreadable as he assessed Julia and the baby. "I don't recall anything in your letter about a child, Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice deep and measured. Julia stood, gathering her courage. "I apologize for the omission, Mr. Ryder. I feared you wouldn't consider my application if I mentioned my daughter. I'm a hard worker and Emma is a good baby. She won't interfere with my duties." He frowned, and for a moment Julia thought he would dismiss her outright. But then Emma chose that moment to open her eyes and stare directly at the imposing rancher with a gurgling smile that had charmed strangers throughout their long journey. Something in Sebastian Ryder's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You've come all the way from Philadelphia?" he asked. "Yes, sir. With no family, no husband," Julia lifted her chin. "My husband died before Emma was born. I have no family remaining who would acknowledge me." Sebastian ran a hand through his hair, clearly wrestling with a decision. "The position I advertised was for a single woman who could devote full attention to keeping house. The ranch isn't a suitable place for a child." Julia felt the last of her hopes crumbling, but she wouldn't beg. She'd find something else, somewhere else, even though she had no idea how. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you for your consideration." She began gathering her things, fighting back tears of desperation. Sebastian watched her for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Mrs. Foster, would you be so kind as to prepare some supplies for Mrs. Lawson and her daughter?" "I'll need to make room in my wagon." Julia looked up in surprise. "Mr. Ryder," he settled his hat back on his head. "This ranch has been a lonely place since Thomas died. Perhaps it needs a family more than it needs just a housekeeper." His tone was gruff, but there was something gentler in his eyes. "I'll give you a month's trial. After that, we'll reassess the arrangement." Julia could hardly believe what she was hearing. "I won't disappoint you, Mr. Ryder." "See that you don't," he replied, but there was no real harshness in his voice. "The ranch is no place for the faint of heart." An hour later, Julia found herself in Sebastian Ryder's wagon, bouncing along the dusty road that led away from Petaluma toward Silver Creek Ranch. Emma slept against her chest, exhausted from the day's excitement. Sebastian drove in silence, occasionally glancing at the woman and child beside him. He'd been alone too long, he thought. What kind of madness had possessed him to bring a widow and her infant to his ranch? The place was rough, demanding, with dangers a city woman couldn't fathom, yet something about her determination had struck him. The quiet dignity in her eyes reminded him of his mother, who had raised 2 boys on this very ranch after their father was killed in a riding accident. Life hadn't broken her spirit, and Sebastian suspected Julia Lawson possessed the same resilience. "The house isn't much," he said as they crested a hill that revealed the ranch in the valley below. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room. You and the child can have the smaller bedroom. It gets cold in winter and hot in summer, but the roof doesn't leak." "It looks perfect," Julia breathed, taking in the sight of the modest house nestled among several outbuildings, corrals, and a barn. Beyond stretched acres of grazing land where cattle dotted the landscape. "It's a working ranch, Mrs. Lawson," Sebastian continued. "I'll expect meals at regular times, laundry once a week, and the house kept orderly. I employ 3 ranch hands who take their meals with us, but they sleep in the bunkhouse." "I understand, Mr. Ryder. I'm prepared to work hard." Sebastian nodded, satisfied with her response. "Good. Hard work is the only thing that matters out here." As they pulled up to the house, Julia noticed the state of disrepair that had settled over what must once have been a warm family home. The porch sagged slightly, the paint was peeling, and the small garden that might have brightened the front yard had long since surrendered to weeds. "Been a while since anyone tended to the extras," Sebastian said, noticing her gaze. "Thomas's wife used to keep flowers growing. After they both died of the fever, I didn't see the point." Julia felt a pang of sympathy for this stern man. "Flowers have a way of lifting the spirit, Mr. Ryder. Perhaps I could resurrect the garden in time." He shrugged as he helped her down from the wagon. "Do as you please with it, so long as your other duties aren't neglected." The inside of the house was clean but Spartan. Functional furniture, few decorations, and a layer of dust that spoke of a man who handled only what was necessary for survival. The kitchen was surprisingly well equipped, though Julia noted the stove would need a thorough cleaning. "I'll bring in your trunk," Sebastian said. "Get yourself and the child settled. Supper's usually at 6, but considering the circumstances, the men can make do with sandwiches tonight." "That won't be necessary," Julia insisted. "If you'll show me the pantry, I can have a proper meal ready by 6. Sebastian studied her for a moment, then nodded. "As you wish." By 6 o'clock, despite her exhaustion, Julia had managed to prepare a simple but hearty beef stew with biscuits. Emma slept in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a dresser drawer lined with blankets. The kitchen table was set for 5, and Julia had even found time to scrub the worst of the grime from the stove. The ranch hand's Jake, a grizzled man in his 50s, Hector, a quiet Mexican cowboy, and Charlie, a freckled young man barely 20, entered the house with Sebastian, all of them stopping short at the sight of a woman standing by the stove and the smell of real cooking filling the air. "Boys," Sebastian said, "this is Mrs. Lawson. She'll be keeping house for us." He offered no explanation about Emma, and the men, after curious glances at the sleeping baby, seemed to accept the situation without question. That first meal passed with awkward conversation. the men clearly unaccustomed to female company. But by the time Julia served apple cobbler she'd managed to put together from dried apples in the pantry, the atmosphere had relaxed considerably. "Best meal I've had since coming to work here," Charlie declared, then blushed when Sebastian raised an eyebrow at him. "The boss does his best, madam," Jake explained with a wink, "but his biscuits are better suited for horseshoes than eating." Sebastian's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginnings of a smile. "I hired you to wrangle cattle, not critique my cooking, Jake." The men laughed, and Julia felt the first genuine sense of hope since William had fallen ill. Perhaps they could make a place for themselves here. Later, after the men had returned to the bunkhouse and Emma had been fed and changed, Julia sat on the edge of her bed, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back all day to fall. The enormity of what she'd done traveling across the country alone with an infant, placing their future in the hands of a stranger, overwhelmed her. A soft knock at her door startled her. She quickly wiped her eyes before opening it to find Sebastian standing there, looking uncomfortable. "Is everything satisfactory?" he asked, his eyes carefully avoiding the signs of her tears. "Yes, thank you. The room is lovely," he nodded, then held out a small wooden object. "I found this in the attic. Thomas made it for his son before." He cleared his throat. "Thought it might be useful for the baby." Julia took the beautifully crafted cradle from him, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "This is too generous, Mr. Ryder." "Sebastian," he corrected her gruffly. "If we're to share a house, Mrs. Lawson, you might as well use my given name." "Then you must call me Julia," she replied, touched by his unexpected kindness. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, a tentative acknowledgement that perhaps this unusual arrangement might work after all. "Good night, Julia," he said, turning to leave. "Good night, Sebastian," she whispered, watching his broad shoulders disappear down the hallway. That night, as Emma slept peacefully in her new cradle, Julia gazed out the window at the vastness of the California sky, more brilliant with stars than she'd ever seen in Philadelphia. For the first time since William's death, she felt a flicker of something that might someday grow into contentment. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm Julia hadn't experienced since, before William fell ill. She rose early, prepared breakfast for Sebastian and the hands, tended to Emma, and spent her days transforming the neglected house into a home. The physical labor was demanding, but she welcomed it. Each scrubbed floor and polished piece of furniture felt like reclaiming a part of herself that grief had buried. Sebastian spent most daylight hours working with the cattle or repairing fences and buildings around the property. He spoke little during meals, but began lingering afterward, sipping coffee while Julia cleared the table. She noticed he had a habit of watching Emma with a curious expression, especially as the baby grew more active and vocal. One evening in late September, Julia was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. Emma nestled in a basket nearby when she heard the unmistakable rattle of a snake. Her blood froze as she spotted the rattlesnake coiled just feet from Emma's basket, disturbed by the shadow Julia had unwittingly cast over it. "Don't move," came Sebastian's low command from behind her. Before she could react, he'd stepped forward, a shovel from the garden in hand. With quick, precise movements, he dispatched the snake, then immediately checked the basket. "She's fine," he assured Julia, who had collapsed to her knees in delayed shock. "It didn't get near her." "I should have been watching more carefully," Julia said, her voice trembling as she gathered Emma into her arms. "I never thought you can't watch for everything," Sebastian said, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "That's the reality of ranch life. There are dangers city folk don't think about." His hand remained on her shoulder a moment longer than necessary, and when he removed it, Julia felt the absence of his warmth acutely. "I should teach you to shoot," he said suddenly. "Every woman on a ranch should know how to handle a gun." The offer surprised her. "My father would never permit such a thing. He considered firearms unladylike." Sebastian's mouth quirked. "With respect to your father, Mrs. Lawson, there's nothing ladylike about being defenseless. Tomorrow morning, before breakfast, we'll start your lessons." True to his word, Sebastian appeared at dawn the next day with a rifle and a revolver. Emma, always an early riser, watched with fascination from her basket as Sebastian patiently showed Julia how to load, aim, and fire both weapons. "You have a good eye," he commented when her third shot with the revolver hit reasonably close to the target he'd set up. "Practice daily and you'll be proficient in no time." Julia found herself strangely exhilarated by the new skill. "My mother would be scandalized," she laughed. "Perhaps," Sebastian agreed, "but she'd prefer a scandalized daughter to a dead one." The bluntness of his statement sobered her, but she appreciated his honesty. Life on the frontier required different rules than those she'd grown up with in Philadelphia society. As October painted the surrounding hills with autumn colors, Julia noticed subtle changes in Sebastian. He began bringing small gifts when he returned from trips into town: a ribbon for Emma's hair, a jar of peach preserves he knew Julia favored, or a book he thought she might enjoy. He started spending evenings by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes just watching as Julia sewed or played with Emma. One evening, as a rare autumn storm lashed the windows with rain, Sebastian surprised her by asking about William. "How did you meet your husband?" The question came softly as they sat in the warmth of the fireplace, Emma already asleep for the night. Julia set aside her mending. "At a literary society meeting in Philadelphia. William was studying to be a doctor. He was brilliant, kind. My parents approved because his family was well respected." She smiled at the memory. "We were married just a year when he contracted pneumonia from one of his patients. He never recovered." Sebastian's expression was solemn. "And your family, why didn't they support you after his death?" Julia's hands twisted in her lap. "William's family blamed me for his illness, said I didn't care for him properly. My parents, they've always valued appearances above all else. When I discovered I was with child after William died, they gave me an ultimatum. Give the baby to William's childless sister to raise as her own, or leave their house and support myself." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "They would have you give up your child, their own grandchild. They believed an unmarried daughter with a baby would ruin their standing in society. And as a widow with no skills beyond those of a genteel upbringing, my prospects were limited." Julia looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct. "I chose Emma. I will always choose Emma." The firelight cast shadows across Sebastian's face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the unexpected gentleness in his eyes. "You made the right choice." The certainty in his voice warmed something inside Julia. "And you've never spoken of your wife." Sebastian's expression closed like a shuttered window. "I've never been married. I'm sorry, I just assumed. No need to apologize." He stood abruptly. "It's getting late. I'll see you at breakfast." Julia watched him leave, wondering what nerve she'd struck. Later that night, she heard him pacing in the sitting room long after he should have been asleep. The next morning, Jake provided the explanation Sebastian wouldn't offer. The older ranch hand found Julia in the garden, where she was determinedly reclaiming a small patch for herbs and vegetables. "He was engaged once," Jake said without preamble, leaning on a fence post. "About 5 years back, Melissa was her name, pretty girl from Sacramento who came to teach at the schoolhouse in town." Julia paused in her digging. "What happened?" Changed her mind about ranch life. "Said it was too isolated, too hard, left him for a banker in San Francisco." Jake shook his head. "Boss took it hard, threw himself into the ranch, barely went to town after that except for necessities. When Thomas and his wife died, it just about finished him. That explains why he's so." Julia searched for the right word. "Guarded," Jake suggested. "Yep, man's built walls thicker than the bank vault." He straightened up. "But I've been working for the Ryders going on 15 years, and I ain't seen him bring flowers back from town for anybody before you showed up." Before Julia could respond to this revelation, Jake tipped his hat and ambled off toward the barn, leaving her to ponder his words as she turned the soil. That evening, Julia put extra care into dinner, preparing Sebastian's favorite beef stew and fresh bread. When Emma became fussy just as she was setting the table, she was surprised to see Sebastian enter the kitchen and reach for the baby. "I'll hold her while you finish," he offered, lifting Emma with a confidence that suggested he'd had practice with children before. "You're good with her," Julia observed, setting out plates. She doesn't usually warm to strangers so quickly. Sebastian bounced Emma gently, earning a delighted gurgle from the baby. Thomas's boy, James, used to follow me everywhere. Always wanted Uncle Bass to throw him up on a horse or teach him to lasso. His voice grew softer. He was 4 when the fever took him and his parents. Julia's heart ached for the loss she heard in his voice. I'm so sorry, Sebastian, to lose your brother and his family all at once. It's the way of things out here sometimes, he said, but his arms tightened protectively around Emma. Life is precious and precarious. As if sensing the emotion in the room, Emma reached up and patted Sebastian's cheek with her tiny hand. The gesture seemed to surprise him, and Julia watched as the stern rancher's expression softened into something that made her heart skip. She likes you, Julia said softly. Sebastian looked up, and the vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. She's easy to like back. The moment hung between them, fragile and meaningful, until the sound of the ranch hands arriving for dinner broke the spell. Sebastian handed Emma back to Julia, his fingers brushing against hers in the exchange. That night, after everyone had retired, Julia found herself unable to sleep. She slipped from her room and padded quietly to the kitchen for a glass of water, only to find Sebastian seated at the table, a lamp burning low beside him as he worked on what appeared to be the ranch accounts. Couldn't sleep, he asked without looking up. Emma's teething, Julia explained. She finally settled, but I'm still restless. Sebastian closed the ledger. I could make some tea. The domesticity of the offer made Julia smile. That would be lovely, thank you. They sat in comfortable silence as the water boiled, then Sebastian prepared 2 cups of tea with a precision that spoke of ritual. This was my mother's remedy for sleepless nights, he explained, sliding a cup toward her. Chamomile with a touch of honey. Julia sipped the soothing liquid. It's perfect, your mother taught you well. She was an extraordinary woman, came out west with my father when this was still Mexican territory, built this ranch from nothing but wilderness and determination. Pride and sorrow mingled in his voice. She died 6 years ago, peacefully in her sleep. Said she was ready to join my father. You must miss them both terribly, Sebastian nodded. The hardest part after Thomas died was realizing I was the last rider, the end of everything they built together. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with loneliness and regret. It doesn't have to be the end, Julia said gently. The future is still unwritten. His eyes met hers across the table, searching for something. Whatever he found made him reach across and cover her hand with his own. Julia, he began, but was interrupted by Emma's cry from the bedroom. Julia stood reluctantly. I should go to her, Sebastian nodded, withdrawing his hand. Of course. Good night, Julia. Good night, Sebastian, she replied, and as she walked back to her room, she could feel his eyes following her, full of unspoken possibilities. November brought colder weather and the first hints of the winter to come. The ranch's pace changed as Sebastian and the hands prepared the herd and property for the harsher season. Julia found herself busier than ever, preserving the last of the garden's harvest, mending winter clothes, and ensuring the house was properly sealed against drafts. Emma, now 7 months old, was sitting up on her own and beginning to crawl, exploring the world with determined curiosity. Sebastian had taken to carrying her around the house in the evenings, pointing out things and naming them as if she could understand every word. Julia often paused in her work to watch them, her heart warming at the sight of the once stern rancher, completely captivated by a baby's smile. As Thanksgiving approached, Sebastian surprised Julia by announcing they would host a dinner for some of the neighboring ranchers and townspeople. The Ryder Ranch always held a Thanksgiving gathering, he explained. My mother started the tradition. After Thomas died, I let it lapse, but I think it's time to revive it. Julia was touched by the gesture, recognizing it as another sign of Sebastian emerging from the shell of grief that had encased him. It would be my pleasure to help you continue your mother's tradition. The preparations for the dinner gave Julia a glimpse into Sebastian's standing in the community. Despite his reputation for reclusiveness, the invitations were met with enthusiastic acceptances. People respected him, she realized, even if they found him intimidating. On the morning before Thanksgiving, Julia was kneading dough for pies when Sebastian entered the kitchen carrying a large box. "These were my mother's," he said, setting it on the table. "I thought you might want to use them tomorrow." Inside, Julia found exquisite china plates, crystal glasses, and silver serving pieces, all carefully wrapped in linen. "They're beautiful," she breathed, lifting a hand-painted plate. "Are you certain you want to use them? They must be precious to you." "They were meant to be used for gatherings like this," Sebastian said, watching her unwrap each piece. "Mother would have wanted it that way." Julia looked up at him, struck by how much he'd changed in the nearly 3 months since she'd arrived. The hard edges remained, but they were softened now, like stone weathered by time and elements. "Sebastian," she ventured, "I want you to know how grateful Emma and I are for everything you've done for us, taking us in when you had every reason not to, giving us a home." "You've earned your place here," he interrupted, his voice gruff with emotion he seemed reluctant to show. "The house hasn't been this much of a home since my mother was alive." Before Julia could respond, he turned and left the kitchen abruptly. She watched him go, wondering at the man whose kindness was so often hidden behind a facade of sternness. Thanksgiving Day dawned bright and cold. The house filled with delicious aromas as Julia prepared the feast with help from Mrs. Foster, who had arrived early with her husband. By afternoon, the ranch was bustling with guests, neighboring ranchers and their families. The doctor from town, the minister and his wife, even the banker who handled Sebastian's accounts. Julia found herself warmly welcomed into the community, with many of the women expressing delight at the positive changes they noticed in both Sebastian and the ranch. Emma was passed from one admiring arm to another, thriving on the attention. "You've worked miracles here, Mrs. Foster whispered to Julia as they surveyed the lively gathering in the sitting room. "Sebastian hasn't invited a soul to this ranch since his brother died. Now look at him." Julia followed her gaze to where Sebastian stood by the fireplace, deep in conversation with Dr. Wallace, a smile actually playing at his lips. As if sensing her attention, he looked up, his eyes finding hers across the room. Something in his gaze made her cheeks warm, and she quickly turned back to arranging dessert plates. The dinner was a resounding success. 20 people crowded around the extended dining table, sharing food, stories, and laughter. Sebastian, at the head of the table, seemed a different man entirely from the stern rancher who had reluctantly taken in a widow and her child just months before. When it came time for the traditional giving of thanks, Sebastian stood, commanding the room's attention with his presence. "Many of you know that I've had little to be thankful for these past years," he began, his deep voice carrying clearly. "Loss has a way of narrowing your vision until all you can see is what's missing from your life." He paused, his gaze drifting to where Julia sat with Emma on her lap. "But sometimes fate has other plans," he continued. "Sometimes what you need comes in unexpected packages." A murmur of knowing chuckles rippled through the guests. "I'm grateful to all of you for being part of the Ryder Ranch tradition today, and I'm especially thankful for Julia and Emma, who have reminded me that a house without laughter isn't really a home at all." Julia felt tears prick her eyes as several guests raised their glasses in agreement. The look Sebastian gave her held something more than gratitude, something that made her heart race with possibilities. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall. Julia stood on the porch, Emma bundled against the cold in her arms, waving goodbye to the last wagon. Sebastian joined them, wrapping a blanket around Julia's shoulders against the chill. "They'll be talking about your cooking for months," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "It was wonderful to meet everyone," Julia replied. "I can see why your mother started the tradition." They watched the snow falling in comfortable silence for a moment, Emma reaching out with fascination to catch the flakes. "Your month's trial ended some time ago," Sebastian said suddenly. "I never mentioned it because—" He trailed off, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. Julia's heart constricted with fear. "Is there a problem with my work? If I've been neglecting something—" "No," he interrupted quickly. "Your work is exceptional. That's not what I meant." He turned to face her, his expression serious in the lantern light. "I'd like to make a more permanent arrangement," Julia swallowed, not daring to hope. "What sort of arrangement?" Sebastian took a deep breath. "When you arrived, I said this ranch needed a family. I meant it then as a kindness, but now I realize how true those words were." He reached out tentatively to touch Emma's cheek. "I've grown attached to both of you, more than attached." Julia could barely breathe as he continued. "I know it hasn't been long, and I know your heart may still belong to William. I'm not asking you to love me, Julia. But I'm offering you and Emma security, respectability, and a home that would be truly yours." He met her eyes directly. "I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife." The words hung in the snowy air between them. Julia looked at this man who had changed so much in the short time she'd known him, from the stern, lonely rancher to someone who could hold her daughter with such tenderness, who could open his home and his heart after years of shutting both away. "Sebastian," she began carefully, "I won't pretend that William doesn't still hold a place in my heart. He was my first love and Emma's father." Sebastian nodded, his expression guarded but understanding. "But," Julia continued, shifting Emma to her hip so she could reach out and take his hand, "hearts have a capacity for new love. In these months, you've become important to me in ways I never expected. I'm not the same woman who stepped off that stagecoach, and you're not the same man who reluctantly took us in." Hope kindled in Sebastian's eyes. "Is that a yes?" Julia smiled, snow catching in her eyelashes. "It's a yes, Sebastian Ryder. Emma and I would be honored to become your family." The smile that broke across his face transformed him completely. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and kissed her, one arm encircling both her and Emma. The kiss was gentle yet firm, a promise of the man he was and the husband he would be. When they parted, Emma reached for Sebastian, who took her into his arms with practiced ease. "Pa," the baby exclaimed clearly, her first recognizable word. Sebastian froze, looking from Emma to Julia with astonishment. Did she just... Julia laughed, tears of joy mingling with snowflakes on her cheeks. "It seems Emma approves of our arrangement." Sebastian held the baby closer, emotion raw on his face. "I never thought I'd hear that word directed at me." "Well," Julia said softly, leaning against his side as they turned to go back into the warmth of the house, "she's just the first who'll call you that." The promise in her words made Sebastian's arm tighten around her waist as they stepped across the threshold together. No longer employer and housekeeper, but a family beginning to take shape. They were married 2 weeks before Christmas in the small church in Petaluma, with the entire community turning out for the event. Mrs. Foster helped Julia adapt one of Sebastian's mother's dresses for the occasion, a rich burgundy velvet that complemented her auburn hair. Emma, dressed in white lace, charmed everyone from her perch in Jake's arms as he stood proudly beside Sebastian. "Never thought I'd see the day," the old ranch hand whispered to Hector as Sebastian and Julia exchanged vows. "Boss smiling like that, it's downright unnatural." But there was nothing but natural joy in the celebration that followed, as neighbors and friends gathered at the ranch for a feast that rivaled Thanksgiving. Julia moved through the crowd as Mrs. Ryder, still hardly believing the turn her life had taken since that desperate day she'd arrived in Petaluma. "You look beautiful," Sebastian murmured when he finally managed to claim a moment alone with his bride in the kitchen. "And happy." "I am happy," Julia replied, reaching up to straighten his tie. "Happier than I ever thought I could be again." Sebastian captured her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I want to show you something. Can you slip away for a moment?" Curious, Julia followed him through the house and up the narrow stairs to the attic, a space she'd cleaned but rarely visited. In the corner stood a large object covered with a sheet. "I've been working on this when you thought I was in the barn," Sebastian explained, suddenly looking boyishly uncertain. "It's not quite finished, but I wanted you to see it today." He pulled away the sheet to reveal a beautifully crafted wooden cradle, larger and more elaborate than the one Thomas had made. The headboard was carved with delicate flowers and leaves, and along the side ran a perfect rendition of Silver Creek, complete with tiny fish jumping from the water. Sebastian, Julia breathed, running her fingers over the exquisite workmanship. It's magnificent. My father taught Thomas and me woodworking, he explained. I haven't made anything in years, but, he looked at her meaningfully, we might need this sooner than you think. Julia's eyes widened as his implication became clear. Are you saying you want more children? Sebastian nodded, his expression serious. I want everything with you, Julia, a house full of children if you're willing. Sons and daughters who will grow up knowing they're loved, who will carry on what my parents built here. Tears sprang to Julia's eyes at the depth of emotion in his voice. This man, who had seemed so closed off when she first met him, was now offering her his complete heart. I want that too, she whispered, stepping into his embrace. I want to build that future with you. When they returned to the celebration downstairs, several knowing glances were exchanged among the guests at the private smile the newlyweds shared, but no one commented. It was enough to see the transformation in Sebastian Ryder from the solitary rancher to a man whose eyes followed his new wife with undisguised adoration. As the winter deepened, the newlyweds settled into a rhythm of married life. The ranch continued to demand hard work from dawn till dusk, but now the days ended with shared meals and evenings by the fire, often with Emma playing on a blanket between them. Sebastian gradually opened up about his past, sharing stories of his childhood on the ranch, the dreams he and Thomas had shared, and the deep loneliness that had engulfed him after losing his entire family. In turn, Julia told him more about her life in Philadelphia, the stifling expectations of society, and her brief, happy marriage to William. Rather than jealousy, Sebastian expressed gratitude to the man who had loved Julia first and given her Emma. He must have been a good man to have earned your love, Sebastian said one evening as they sat by the fire, and I'll make sure Emma knows about her father as she grows up. The generosity of his sentiment moved Julia deeply. You are a remarkable man, Sebastian Ryder. He shook his head, embarrassed by her praise. I'm just a rancher trying to do right by the people I love. The casual use of the word love hung in the air between them. Though they had married quickly and were still learning each other's ways, the emotion had been growing steadily, unspoken but unmistakable. Julia set aside her mending and moved to sit beside him on the sofa. You haven't said it yet, you know. Sebastian looked at her quizzically. Said what? That you love me. Her voice was soft, not accusatory. Sebastian's expression changed as understanding dawned. He took her hands in his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I thought it was obvious, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've loved you since the day you stood in Mrs. Foster's store and refused to beg for the position, even though you had nowhere else to go. Your courage, your devotion to Emma, the way you've brought life back to this ranch and to me. He paused, swallowing hard. I love you, Julia Ryder. More than I thought it was possible to love anyone. Joy bloomed in Julia's chest. And I love you, Sebastian, not for the security you've given us, though I'm grateful for that. I love the man who brought flowers from town because he remembered I mentioned missing my mother's garden. The man who reads to Emma every night, even though she doesn't understand the words. The man who looks at me as if I'm a miracle when I'm just a woman trying to make a home for the people she loves. Their first kiss as an acknowledged love rather than a practical partnership was different, deeper, more certain, full of promises for the future they would build together. Spring came to Silver Creek Ranch with a riot of wildflowers and new calves in the pastures. Emma took her first steps in the garden Julia had fully restored, tottering from Sebastian's outstretched hands toward her mother with determined concentration on her little face. The achievement was celebrated as if she'd climbed a mountain, with Sebastian swinging her high in the air while she giggled uncontrollably. As April turned to May, Julia's suspicions were confirmed by Dr. Wallace. She was expecting a child, due in late autumn. She planned a special dinner to share the news with Sebastian, sending the ranch hands to town for the evening so they could be alone. Is everything all right? Sebastian asked as he entered the house that evening, concern evident in his voice. Jake said you'd given them the night off. Julia smiled, taking his hat and kissing him lightly. Everything is perfect. I just wanted some time alone with my husband. Sebastian relaxed, drawing her into a proper embrace. I like the sound of that. During dinner, Julia watched him enjoying the special meal she'd prepared, her heart full of anticipation. Finally, as they lingered over dessert, she reached across the table for his hand. I have something to tell you, she began, suddenly nervous despite knowing how welcome her news would be. Sebastian squeezed her hand encouragingly. You can tell me anything, Julia. The cradle you made, she said, we'll be needing it sooner than later. Dr. Wallace confirms the baby will arrive in November. For a moment, Sebastian seemed frozen, processing her words. Then his face transformed with such naked joy that Julia felt tears spring to her eyes. A baby, he whispered, rising from his chair to kneel beside hers. Our baby. He placed his hand reverently on her still flat stomach, then looked up at her with such love that Julia thought her heart might burst. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For Emma, for this new child, for making me a father when I thought that dream was lost forever. Julia cradled his face in her hands. And thank you for giving us a home when we had nowhere else to go, for seeing value in a woman with a baby and no husband. Best decision I ever made, Sebastian murmured, rising to kiss her with tender passion. That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Sebastian's protective arm draped over her waist. Julia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperate young widow who had stepped off the stage-coach in Petaluma less than a year ago could never have imagined finding such complete happiness. What are you thinking about? Sebastian asked sleepily, his breath warm against her neck. About fate, she replied, nestling closer into his embrace. How the worst moments of our lives can lead us to the best if we're brave enough to keep going. I'm glad you were brave enough to come west, he murmured, his arm tightening around her. And I'm glad I was smart enough to see what was standing in front of me. Through the window, moonlight illuminated the peaceful ranch that had become their shared legacy, no longer a lonely outpost for a solitary man, but the heart of a growing family's future. Summer passed in a blur of ranch work and preparations for the baby. Sebastian insisted on expanding the house, adding a proper nursery adjacent to their bedroom and enlarging the kitchen to Julia's specifications. The entire community pitched in, with neighboring ranchers sending men to help with the construction, while their wives contributed fabric for curtains and baby clothes. Emma thrived in the center of all this activity, developing a vocabulary that delighted everyone and following Sebastian around the ranch like a devoted shadow whenever Julia would allow it. Her first birthday in August was celebrated with a picnic by Silver Creek, where Sebastian presented her with a tiny rocking horse he'd carved himself. She's going to be a fine horsewoman someday, he declared as Emma rocked enthusiastically, just like her mother. Julia, whose riding lessons had been another of Sebastian's projects, laughed at the comparison. I think she already has more natural talent than I do. As her pregnancy progressed, Julia found herself surrounded by support. Mrs. Foster visited regularly with advice and remedies for morning sickness. Sebastian hired a young woman from town, Abigail, to help with the heavier household chores. Even the ranch hands contributed, with Jake fashioning toys from wood scraps and Hector bringing herbs from his mother's traditional remedies to ease Julia's swollen ankles. One evening in early October, as the first chill of autumn crept into the air, Sebastian found Julia in the nursery, folding tiny garments and arranging them in the chest of drawers he'd restored from the attic. You should be resting, he admonished gently, coming to stand behind her with his hands on her shoulders. Julia leaned back against him, her rounded belly prominent beneath her apron. I couldn't sleep. The baby's been active tonight. Sebastian's hands moved to cradle her stomach, and as if on cue, the baby kicked against his palm. The wonder on his face never diminished no matter how many times he felt the movement. Strong, he commented. Like his mother, or her father, Julia countered, smiling. They had chosen not to guess the baby's gender, agreeing that health was all that mattered. Sebastian guided her to the rocking chair by the window, kneeling beside her once she was settled. In the moonlight, his face looked younger, the worry lines that had been so prominent when they first met now softened by months of happiness. "I've been thinking," he said, taking her hand, "about names." "Oh, and what have you decided?" Julia asked, amused by his serious expression. "If it's a boy, I'd like to name him William Thomas," Sebastian said quietly. To honor both his grandfathers and the father Emma lost, Julia's eyes filled with tears at the unexpectedness of his suggestion. "Sebastian, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," he assured her. "I just want our children to know their history, all of it. William was part of what brought you to me, and I'll always be grateful for that." In that moment, Julia knew she had never loved him more completely. "And if it's a girl," Sebastian smiled. "I thought perhaps Elizabeth Grace after my mother, but I'm open to other suggestions." "Elizabeth Grace Ryder," Julia repeated, testing the name. "It's beautiful." As November approached, the entire ranch prepared for the birth. Dr. Wallace arranged to stay in the guest room as Julia's time grew near, not wanting to risk the journey from town if labor began suddenly. Sebastian grew increasingly nervous, checking on Julia constantly and rereading the medical texts Dr. Wallace had lent him. "You'd think he was the first man in history to become a father," Jake commented to Julia one afternoon when Sebastian insisted on carrying a basket of washing that she was perfectly capable of handling. "Let him fuss," Julia replied with a fond smile. "It makes him feel useful." The baby, however, had plans of its own. On a clear, cold morning in early November, 2 weeks before Dr. Wallace's estimated date, Julia woke to the unmistakable sensation of her waters breaking. "Sebastian," she whispered, shaking her sleeping husband's shoulder, "it's time." The next 12 hours tested Julia's strength and Sebastian's composure. Dr. Wallace directed the proceedings with calm efficiency, while Sebastian remained steadfastly by Julia's side, wiping her brow and murmuring encouragement through each contraction. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he told her when the pain seemed unbearable. "You can do this, Julia. Our child is almost here." Outside the bedroom, the ranch hands took turns caring for Emma and pacing the hallway. Abigail kept a steady supply of hot water and clean linens coming, while Mrs. Foster, who had been summoned by Charlie, prepared sustaining broth for Julia between contractions. As the sun began to set, casting the bedroom in golden light, Dr. Wallace announced, "One more push, Mrs. Ryder. Your baby is eager to meet you." With Sebastian supporting her shoulders and whispering words of love in her ear, Julia gathered her remaining strength for a final effort. The room filled with the lusty cry of a newborn and Dr. Wallace's triumphant voice declaring, "You have a son." Tears streamed down Sebastian's face as he watched Dr. Wallace place the squalling infant on Julia's chest. "He's perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Julia, he's absolutely perfect." William Thomas Ryder had his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. As Julia cradled him against her breast, his cries subsided and he blinked up at his parents with unfocused eyes. "Hello, William," Julia murmured, tracing his tiny features with a gentle finger. "We've been waiting for you." Sebastian couldn't tear his gaze away from his son. "I never knew it was possible to love someone instantly," he said in wonder, "but I'd die for him already." "That's what being a parent means," Julia replied, understanding completely the fierce protectiveness that surged through her own heart. Once Julia and the baby were clean and settled, Sebastian brought Emma in to meet her baby brother. The toddler approached the bed cautiously, her eyes wide as she peered at the bundle in her mother's arms. "Baby?" she asked, pointing. "Yes, sweetheart," Julia confirmed. "This is your brother, William." "William," Emma repeated carefully, then looked up at Sebastian. "My baby," Sebastian lifted her onto the bed beside Julia. "Yes, Emma, he's your baby brother and you're going to help Mama and Papa take care of him." The seriousness with which Emma nodded made both parents smile. She leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on her brother's forehead, an act of such natural affection that Julia felt her heart might burst with love for her growing family. News of William's birth spread quickly through the community. Over the following days, a steady stream of visitors arrived at the ranch bearing gifts and good wishes. Sebastian received each guest with uncharacteristic patience, proudly showing off his son while ensuring Julia had the rest she needed. By Christmas, Julia was fully recovered, and the household had adjusted to the rhythms of life with a newborn. The ranch house was decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons, and Sebastian had cut a perfect tree that stood in the corner of the sitting room, adorned with paper ornaments that he and Julia had made with Emma. On Christmas Eve, after the children were asleep, Sebastian and Julia sat before the fire, enjoying a rare moment of quiet togetherness. "I have something for you," Sebastian said, reaching into his pocket. "I wanted to give it to you privately." He handed Julia a small wooden box, beautifully carved with the same floral pattern he had used on William's cradle. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a gold locket on a delicate chain. "Sebastian, it's beautiful," Julia gasped, lifting it from the box. "Open it," he urged. Inside were two tiny photographs, Emma on one side and William on the other, their baby faces captured by the traveling photographer who had visited Petaluma the previous month. "I had it made in Sacramento," Sebastian explained as he fastened the chain around her neck. "So you can keep them close to your heart always." Julia touched the locket reverently, then turned to embrace her husband. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received. Thank you." Sebastian held her close, his cheek resting against her hair. "I have one more surprise," he murmured. "I've invited your parents to visit in the spring." Julia pulled back in shock. "My parents? But how? Why?" "I wrote to them after William was born," Sebastian admitted. "Sent them photographs of you and the children, told them about the ranch, about our life here." He took her hands in his. "They've missed 3 years of their daughter's life and 2 grandchildren. Whatever their mistakes, that's punishment enough." Julia was speechless, torn between anger at the reminder of her parents' rejection and astonishment at Sebastian's act of reconciliation. "They've accepted," he added softly. "Your father wrote that they deeply regret their actions and would very much like to meet their grandchildren and the man who had the wisdom they lacked." Tears filled Julia's eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive them." "You don't have to decide tonight," Sebastian assured her. "We have months before they arrive, but Christmas seemed the right time to offer the possibility of forgiveness." Julia rested her head against his shoulder, considering his words. "When did you become so wise about families?" Sebastian chuckled. "I had an excellent teacher, a woman who showed me that love is worth any risk, any sacrifice." As the fire crackled and snow began to fall outside the windows, Julia thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The desperate young widow stepping off the stagecoach, the stern rancher reluctantly offering a month's trial, the gradual awakening of love between 2 wounded souls. And now, a home filled with the sounds of children and the promise of reconciliation with her past. "Next Christmas, William will be walking," Sebastian mused, his arm secure around her waist. "And perhaps there will be another cradle to prepare," Julia suggested softly, feeling his breath catch at her implication. Sebastian turned to her with hopeful eyes. "Already?" Julia laughed at his eagerness. "Not yet, but someday soon. I think Silver Creek Ranch could use a few more riders, don't you?" The kiss Sebastian gave her was answer enough. Full of love and promises for the future, they would continue building together, a future that had begun with a leap of faith when a woman arrived with a baby and no husband. And a lonely rancher recognized that his empty house needed the very family standing before him. As midnight approached and Christmas Day began, Julia Ryder looked around at the home and family she had found in this unlikely place, and knew with absolute certainty that she had received the greatest gift of all. A second chance at happiness, built on courage, kindness, and a love strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds.